Hello, everyone. My name's Britta Jones, and on behalf of the Australian Alliance for Animals, I'd like to welcome you all to this webinar to discuss Is Australia's animal welfare policy system fit for purpose? I'm one of the co-founders and director of strategy for the Alliance, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. At the moment, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this country and throughout Australia, and the enduring connections of First Nations people to land, sea and community, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. So we have got a packed agenda today with some really fascinating findings that we're keen to share with you. The format of this webinar will be in two parts. We'll kick off with a presentation from Dr. Meg Shaw from BehaviourWorks Australia, who'll present our survey findings. That should take us up to just after 1 p.m, and then we'll have some time for some questions. Then I'll bring in my colleague, Jed Goodfellow from the Alliance, who'll provide context to some of the key findings in terms of the current welfare policy environment in Australia. And we'll have time for a few more questions after Jed's presentation. So please make sure if you want to ask questions to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask your questions. You can drop those in at any time during the presentations. If you want to share comments or tell us what country you're joining us from, you can do that in the chat. Okay, so let's start with a brief reminder of who the Alliance for Animals is and what we're here to talk about today. The Australian Alliance for Animals is a national charity that exists to lead and unite Australia's animal protection community in securing systemic change for animals. So we do this through advocating for new systems of animal welfare governance, holding governments to account on their commitments and their decisions affecting animals, and by bringing allies together to strengthen the representation of animals at a political level. Our flagship reforms sit under our Fair Go for Animals campaign. And these are 6 reforms that are intended to change the way that animal welfare policies are developed and governed in Australia. So these include establishing an independent National Animal Welfare Commission and state animal welfare authorities, recognising sentience in legislation, improving our animal welfare standards development process, and increasing government funding for animal welfare. And you'll see that there are findings relating to all of these reforms in today's presentations. As I mentioned, a key part of our work is bringing allies together. So in addition to our 6 core member organisations that are at the top of this slide, we now have over 60 organisations across Australia that have endorsed our Fair Go for Animals campaign. And these organisations, all support our reform agenda. We expect this number to grow even further as we reach out to a wider range of groups. Earlier this month, the Alliance celebrated our 4th birthday, and we took some time out to reflect on the past 4 years of our work. I think above all, the strength of unity and collaboration that's now happening in the animal welfare sector is our proudest achievement. And I'd like to thank our members and allies for their part in creating this unity and collaboration. But back to the purpose of today's webinar. 3 years ago, we shared the results of a nationally representative survey conducted by leading behaviour change research institute, BehaviourWorks Australia, who are based at Monash University. And that survey explored Australian attitudes and beliefs about animal welfare policy. This year, with financial support provided by the Buddy Giving program, we've engaged BehaviourWorks again to conduct a similar survey. This time, we've been able to investigate if Australians' views have changed, as well as to ask some new questions about the review of animal welfare standards, government funding for animal welfare, and how animal welfare policies might change voters' perceptions of political candidates. So, To tell you all about the results of the 2026 survey, I'd like to introduce Dr. Meg Shaw. Meg is a research fellow at BehaviourWorks Australia who specialises in understanding why we do the things that we do. She's originally a conservation scientist, and her interests lie in communication, conservation, and biodiversity, and designing messages to motivate people to act for the environment. Since joining BehaviourWorks in 2024, Meg has been working to map behavioural journeys and to understand the drivers and barriers for pro-environmental behaviours. So welcome, Meg.
Thank you so much for having me. All right, I will just make sure that my screen is sharing. Can everybody see that? And it's definitely the slides and not the presenter view. Fabulous. Thank you so much for the introduction, Bitter. As Bitter said, my name is Meg. I'm a research fellow at BehaviourWorks and really excited to take you through the results from the 2026 survey and where there's been changes and also some of the findings of the new questions that we've asked as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about why this project happened. Obviously, Bit has given you a little bit of context. Then we'll talk about how we did it, so how the survey was implemented, what we found, and then a little bit of what this might mean for both policymakers and for animal welfare and advocacy groups. But obviously, Jed will go into that in quite a bit more detail as well. So in terms of why the survey's run, obviously Bit has given some really good context on that. For us as a behavior change organization, so we're basically built up of a whole range of mostly PhD qualified behavioral scientists based at the Melbourne Business, so the Monash Business School at Monash University. And we try and work on projects to understand people. So a lot of the time it's what they do, but also what they think, what their attitudes are, basically to understand what behavior change tools work best, and particularly for you, what levers you can pull to bring people on board. And so when it comes to animal welfare, obviously we really need to understand what Australians think, feel, and what they do to act for both individual change, so changing their behavior, but also for that kind of systemic change that we want to see in order to advance better outcomes for animals. We also need to understand what Australians expect of their governments when it comes to animal welfare policy, so that we know where current policy is lacking. I mean, a lot of us know where policy is lacking, but to see where the Australian expectation is different from the government, and also, yeah, where policy fails to represent what Australians want. Again, you probably know a lot more about this than I do because I'm a behavioral scientist, but there's behavior change at lots of different levels. So for policy decision makers, it's important that they can influence animal welfare through behaviors like changing the standards or processes for how animals are treated and protected. For groups in the animal welfare ecosystem, like advocacy organizations, charities, NGOs, that kind of thing, they can influence animal welfare through their behaviors, like changing how policy is made or enforced, advocating for certain things, lobbying, so on and so forth, and obviously the actual direct impacts that they have on animals. And then when we look at the general Australian, they also have quite a lot of influence on animal welfare through their behavior, both again through their interactions with animals and their personal behaviors through advocacy. But importantly, when we look at the findings from this survey, they also put pressure on policy decision makers through things like the vote and their communication with politicians and policymakers. Obviously, if you want to be elected and remain in power, you need to be able to highlight to the public that you're listening to them and reflecting their concerns. And so hopefully some of this, the results from this report can show where there's a bit of mismatch happening at the moment, and where communication could be leveraged or improved. So in terms of what we did, how we actually measured this, obviously Bitter talked a little bit about the 2023 survey, which focused a little bit more on people's personal behaviours, whereas this time we were more interested in understanding particularly the policy side of things and people's expectations of government. So for this updated 2026 study, we worked with the Alliance to workshop a list of the most informative and useful questions from the 2023 survey, as well as a list of new topics that we wanted to include in this survey that weren't in the previous survey. And so, as I said, we focused a little bit less on like the public behavior and more on like specific welfare policy preferences, people's expectation of government and also perceptions of specific political candidates and whether that changed based on their policies on animal welfare. We then developed the online Qualtrics survey. So the order of the survey looked a little bit like this, going from understanding people's views on animal suffering and animal sentience, all the way through to understanding who the participants were themselves, so demographics and that kind of thing. We then Oh, here we go. Sorry, forgot I put that animation in there. So this is showing you a little bit of the difference between the two surveys. On the left is the 2026 survey. On the right is the 2023 survey. That survey went out again to a sample of about 1,000 Australians, roughly representative by gender, age, location. The 2023 survey was published and is accessible for people to go and have a look at, both the survey and the report. And it's under embargo at the moment, but there will be the option as well for the 2026 survey to be accessible and the data and the survey itself. So now on to the fun part. Sorry, for some reason my slide progression is not working ideally. So that's why I keep clicking different things. What we found out about Australians' animal welfare beliefs and policy preferences. So I'm going to start off with looking at people's perceptions of animal sentience. And the key takeaway from this is that Australians believe that most animals are sentient, that their suffering is important to reduce, and that the sentience of animals should be explicitly recognized in the law. So this question was a question that also came up in the 2023 survey. And again, the 2026 results show that the majority of Australians, so 8 in 10 or more, consider particularly like your common mammals and birds to be sentient. So this includes things from companion animals like cats and dogs through to some of your farmed animals and also wild animals as well. More than half of Australians also considered several other types of animals to be sentient. But interestingly, the main exceptions were insects and shrimp and prawns. But the main thing I want you to look at here is not that people didn't think that they were sentient. Actually, most people were just unsure. So you can see here, there's quite a lot of people selecting neither agree or disagree and don't know. And it's a much larger proportion of that than it is of that these animals aren't sentient. So particularly when it comes to this group, it's more that people just don't know and maybe need some more clarity rather than they have a set view that insects and shrimp and prawns are not sentient. What was also quite interesting was particularly the difference between how people rated birds generally and chickens in particular. So chickens, 75% of people thought that they were sentient, whereas birds more generally was 81%. So this might be highlighting that there's a little bit of a different attitude towards animals that are raised for food compared to like animals that might be encountered in the wild or animals more generally. And potentially that's a good communication angle there because they're the same thing in a lot of ways. What was also quite interesting was the fact that when we compared to the 2023 results, perceptions of sentience either stayed the same or more people thought that they were sentient, but insects and fish were the opposite. So these were the two that had a slight decline in the amount of people that thought they were sentient. And it's quite interesting as well because since the 2023 survey, more and more scientific evidence has come out showing that these species are sentient. So there's potentially some sort of mismatch there between like public perceptions and scientific evidence, which again could be a good sort of communication channel for getting the message out there about the sentience of these species. We also decided in the 2026 survey to look at relative suffering. So that is like if reducing suffering should matter more for some species than others. And in this case, we focused on the chicken and the cow. It allows us to explore whether perceptions of sentience influence these views and also whether people think that suffering in one animal is more than the other one. So in the previous chart, 84% of Australians viewed cows as sentient compared to 75% who viewed chickens as sentient. But despite this difference, the results actually show that 73% of Australians believe that reducing suffering in a cow should matter as much as reducing sentience in a chicken. So it suggests that for most Australians, the importance of reducing animal suffering doesn't depend strongly on the perception of sentience. Again, this is just comparing two species. Probably, we need to examine it across other species, but this is a really good sign that reducing suffering may not have a strong link to whether people think the animal is sentient or not. And interestingly, these views were pretty broadly consistent across political preferences. So the majority of people, no matter what political party they supported, believed that reducing suffering in a cow versus reducing suffering in a chicken was mattered the same. So the lowest level of agreement was still 65% for National Party voters, and the highest level of agreement was 90% amongst people who voted for independents or other parties. And you'll see that theme coming through quite a lot of these. I haven't split up every single one of these questions into political support, but broadly across a lot of these findings, it doesn't matter what political party somebody was supporting, it doesn't matter what location they live in, it doesn't matter what age they are. For a lot of these findings, support is consistent. It might range in the level of support, but for most of these questions, the majority of Australians, no matter who they are supporting animal welfare and changes in policy. In 2026, we also asked Australians whether the actual sentience of animals should be explicitly recognised in animal welfare legislation, and 71% of Australians agreed that this should be the case. And again, this was strong across the political spectrum, so it did not matter what party people voted for. Participants were more likely to agree with the statement than disagree, no matter what political party they supported. And that leads us well into the role of government. So we also explored Australians' views on the role of government in shaping animal welfare outcomes, including policy development, regulation, enforcement, funding, and also the timing of when standards should be updated as well. In the 2026 survey, we asked whether Australians believed that decision makers had a responsibility to try and take at least reasonable steps to minimise the impact of their decisions. So whether this be the policies they make, the enforcement practices, so on and so forth, on the welfare of sentient animals, and also whether this responsibility should be actually formalised in the law. And again, there was strong support for both the existence and the legal recognition of this responsibility. Again, the view was broadly consistent across the political spectrum. So the lowest was still 61%, which is a large majority for National Party voters, ranging to 84% support amongst Green voters. So there's obviously this widespread, like cross-partisan support for strengthening accountability and animal welfare decision-making. This is a question that we also asked in 2023. So we asked Australians to prioritise the factors that should be considered in government policy decisions affecting animal welfare by identifying the things that should matter the most and the things that should matter the least. And the trends are pretty consistent to the 2023 survey. So there's a clear and consistent hierarchy of the things that people prioritise when it comes to important factors. So obviously the most important factors were the impact of animals. 78% of people said that that mattered the most, followed quite closely by scientific knowledge and evidence. In contrast, the factors that related somewhat to more consumers, like economic and operational impacts, tended to be more in the medium category, and particularly the impact on regulators and the impact on industries were thought of as like the least important factors for policy decision making. So what these findings are telling us is that Australians place the greatest importance on both outcomes for animals when it comes to animal welfare policy and some evidence-based decision-making, so scientific knowledge and evidence of that. And there's far less weight that's being given to economic and administrative considerations. Another question that we asked in 2023 that's not in this survey was whether people thought that the Australian federal government reflected their concerns about animal welfare. And fewer than half of Australians, so 41%, believed that the government was reflecting their concerns. So in 2026, we reframed this question to assess whether Australians actually wanted this to change. And there's a very clear indication that yes, they do. 79% of Australians indicated that they wanted government policies to better align with community views on animal welfare. And again, this support was consistently high across the political spectrum. The majority of people, no matter what party they voted for, wanted the government to reflect their concerns. So that's quite interesting because it does suggest that the dissatisfaction with what's currently happening is common and it's independent of whether the political party that somebody is supporting is in power or not. So what this is showing is that Australians are seeing like a substantial gap between community expectations and government action on animal welfare and are looking to political leaders to more closely reflect public concern in the laws and the policies that they develop. We also asked Australians how important it was for governments to make and enforce laws protecting animals from cruelty and neglect. And again, near universal support for government action in this area. So a clear majority of Australians, 61%, consider this to be very important. But overall, 89%, so almost 9 in 10 Australians think that this is at least somewhat important. And again, this was remarkably consistent across the political spectrum. So the large majority, the lowest level of support was still 85% for Liberal voters, highest was 93% for independent voters. But notably, again, more than half of each group considered this to be very important. So it is something that is on everybody's minds. So taken together, these findings indicate that animal welfare laws are not only widely supported, but also relatively uncontroversial. And there's strong expectations that governments should both establish new laws and actively enforce the protection and enforce the laws. We also asked this year how much funding Australians thought the government should allocate to initiatives that directly improve animal welfare. Noting we don't have exact figures, but we think the current spending is approximately like $3 to $5 million. Again, the results indicate quite a clear preference for investment. So 48% of Australians thought that the spending should improve, that it should at least double, and quite a significant portion thought that it should be even 5 or more times the current spend. What is also interesting is that a notable 34% of respondents selected don't know, which is consistent not just across animal welfare funding, but across questions we ask for any sort of funding from government, because people aren't always aware about what an appropriate funding level should be. So this shows us that these are real people who are answering these questions. A lot of the time there's uncertainty around how much things cost, both how much things cost to improve, how much things cost currently. And so this sort of points to an opportunity for clearer communication about current spending levels, the costs of how much an effective animal welfare initiative would be, but also the potential impacts of increased investment on animals as well. So not just the cost of how much things need, but also how increased funding would create better outcomes for animals as well, and what those outcomes could be. We also asked Australians how often animal welfare standards and regulations should be reviewed and updated, and there was a very clear preference for relatively frequent updates and far less people who were in that don't know category. So again, 79% of people wanted these standards to be updated at least every 4 to 5 years, and only a small percent thought that they should be updated less frequently. So taken together, these findings suggest that there's a strong majority of Australians that support reviewing animal welfare standards far more than they currently are, at least every 5 years, and many favour even shorter review cycles. So a third of people want these standards to be reviewed every 2 to 3 years. 17% want them to be reviewed every year. So also something that I think Jed will be talking about a little bit more. We also asked Australians about who they thought should have a say on animal welfare, and they want independent, trusted experts to guide animal welfare policy with less influence from political and commercial actors. So the first thing we asked Australians, that was also in the 2023 survey, was what authority should have the final decision-making power, and 64% of Australians wanted that to be an independent agency. Regardless of who that agency was, when we asked them if they wanted the final say to be made by an independent and impartial authority, whether that's a government agency or something else, 77% of Australians, so again, the clear majority, wanted whoever it was who made the final decision to be independent and impartial from government. So these findings suggest that Australians will still they prefer a different governance and decision-making arrangement for animal welfare policy decisions than what is currently in place. And regardless of what form that takes, they want it to be independent and impartial. We also looked at what Australians thought should have the most say on animal welfare. And again, this reflected the results from the 2023 survey, grouped by most say, least say, and some say. animal welfare groups and animal welfare researchers and practitioners were the ones that Australians wanted to have the most say, so the most trusted messengers and voices. In contrast, again, those groups that are more in the economic space tended to be a little bit more, people were a little bit less sure. They thought they should have some say, but definitely not as much as animal welfare groups and animal welfare researchers and practitioners. And then when we look at retail and food companies and political parties, these tended to be put in the least say category. And again, these findings were pretty consistent across the political spectrum, so there's broad agreement of these things. We also asked not just about who should have say, but how much these voices were trusted. And again, the same sort of hierarchy as before. 73% of people think that animal welfare researchers and practitioners are the most trusted, followed by animal welfare groups at 65%. Again, there's a little bit less surety about general public consumer protection groups and government representatives. And then there's much lower trust of retail and food companies, political parties, and industries and businesses that use animals for commercial purposes. But what was really interesting was some of these groups actually dropped from the 2023 survey. So particularly for the retail and food companies, the amount of distrust increased from 28% to 42%, which is really big. And the political parties' distrust has risen from 31% to 39%. So that sort of points us, there's a widening gap between highly trusted expert and advocacy groups and lower trust commercial actors. So this can give you some ideas of what voices might be seen as credible in shaping animal welfare policy and practice. Finally, we asked Australians to imagine choosing between two candidates from their preferred political party who differed only in their approach to animal welfare. Candidate A supports stronger policy, candidate B supports maintaining current policy. And again, there's a strong and consistent preference for stronger animal welfare action in candidates in terms of how they were viewed. So 66% of people thought that candidate A was more relatable, more likable, 74% thought they were more likable, and 88% thought that they were more empathetic. And that was pretty consistent, again, amongst political groups. And that mostly translated into voting decision as well. So the majority of people said that they would vote for candidate A versus candidate B. And some were more in that unsure area. But what this is basically telling us is that there's stronger support for animal welfare policies and politicians who have stronger animal welfare policies or stronger animal welfare opinions. But even if that doesn't translate currently into voting decisions, it does confer reputational and electoral advantages to candidates across the political spectrum. So whether you're a Nationals voter or a Greens voter or somewhere in between. In terms of what can government and groups and people who seek to advance animal welfare do based on the findings from this survey, policymakers can update animal welfare policy to better meet the expectations of Australians. As you've seen, there's a lot of expectations that aren't currently meeting reality. Increased transparency around how animal welfare decisions are made and communicated. So Australians aren't feeling like the government reflects their concerns. So the government needs to be transparent about how concerns are being met. Allocate sufficient funding and resources to support animal welfare policy and enforcement. As we've seen, Australians want more funding and more resources than is currently being given to animal welfare. Commit to regular reviews and updates of animal welfare standards and regulations. Again, Australians are wanting those updated more than they currently are. Ensure animal welfare policies remain adaptive and responsive, so not just the standards, but the policies themselves. If they're regularly revised and updated, that's going to help maintain their relevance and effectiveness. Improve monitoring, enforcement, and accountability mechanisms. So again, there was very clear, strong public support for this. Consider the independence and impartiality of the authority that makes the final decisions on animal welfare. Increase engagement with stakeholders and groups trusted by the Australian community, so your animal welfare organisations, your researchers, and then incorporate animal welfare, sentience, and well-being as key considerations in policy decision-making, because these are clearly things that Australians want to see. Advocacy groups, and I'll rush through this one, leverage trust and credibility to shape policy and public discourse. So obviously animal welfare groups, along with researchers, are the most trusted voices. The people who are here today, you are the most trusted voices in this space, according to Australians. So you're credible leaders who can influence policy, can talk to the media, can talk to the general Australian and help with public understanding of animal welfare policy. Continue to center evidence-based messaging and expertise. So if you want to partner with researchers to bring out evidence-based messages, that is something that Australians really seem to appreciate and value. Emphasize impacts on animals to strengthen engagement. So obviously the impact on animals was something that most Australians really cared about. So being able to communicate that with people is very important. Build strategic collaborations with experts. So like I said, potentially that's partnering with scientific researchers, potentially that's somebody else, but other groups that are trusted in that space. Engage constructively with government. There is a space for trusted messages to lobby and advocate for greater accountability in the groups that, government or other groups that aren't currently doing the best animal welfare practices. And that will help address like declining trust in industry by holding people accountable, but also helping with best practices. But the most important thing is that animal welfare is framed as broadly supported and nonpartisan. I think a lot of the time it can seem like more of a divisive issue than this survey is showing us. There seems to be a strong level of support and care for animal welfare, no matter who you are. And hopefully that gives you a lot of confidence in the work that you're doing. And that's it from me. Oh, also, we're sharing the results. I'm sure this will be sent out in an email, but this is the link for that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Meg. That was fantastic. So much information crammed into there. We've got a few little themes that have emerged with the questions, so I'm going to group some of them together. The first one I can probably answer because it's about sharing the results. So we will be recording this webinar. The recording will be available on the Alliance for Animals website. If you've registered, then you will get the link to that recording. We'll also be providing the full report, also available from our website. That'll come next week. And in due course, the entire survey and methodology will be available on Open Science. But in the meantime, we will be also sharing the results with a whole range of different stakeholders, including politicians, with government, and really making sure that they're aware of the results. It's a fantastic to-do list for policymakers that you've put up there at the end of your presentation, and that we definitely will be sharing those dot points with decision makers. So thank you for putting that together. I think, look, the most important question that a number of people have asked is about methodology. So if you could just talk to us a little bit about sort of how the survey was conducted, what makes it nationally representative, and also how it builds on the survey from 2023, which kind of provides even more kind of robustness to the data.
Yeah. So basically, when we do a survey like this, we reach out to a panel agency. So they have a very big database of a range of Australians who do surveys. Surprisingly, there is a wide range of ages, locations. So lots of people like doing surveys. But we tell them the demographics that we want. So we generally go off the ABS or the census data, and we say we want this percentage of people age this. We want this percentage of people from here. We want this percentage of people of this gender, and so on and so forth. So we capture the demographics that way so that it is as representative as possible. The other demographics that weren't filtered out are also in the final report as well. But looking at the political support, it was roughly the same numbers as what we would expect from the previous election. In terms of the consistency from the previous survey, so the patterns are pretty similar, which is telling us a lot that the populations from the two surveys are quite similar. Also, the findings that people don't know about the funding is a really good sign that these are real people who are being honest in their answers. I saw a question in there about like the definition of sentience as well. That is something that we included. And there was another point that I have completely forgotten, but once I remember it, I will type it into the chat. But yes, basically, we do as best we can. Oh, I know what it was. When the survey is sent out to people from the panel, we don't tell them it's about animal welfare. So when they engage with the survey, they don't know, oh, this is a topic I want to answer questions about, or this isn't a topic that I want to answer questions about. They could leave the survey if they're not interested, but we didn't see a high attrition rate of people dropping out of the survey. But yes, in terms of how it's advertised to people, it's not like it's attracting people who want to answer those questions more than others or are more passionate about the issue.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. I mean, that's really important. It's not an open survey that, groups can push people towards. It's done from a panel, so it's very much in the same way that national polling is done for a whole range of different issues and topics. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. The definition of sentience. So you did touch on this, but yeah, I just wanted to reinforce that there is. In the way the survey was designed, there was a definition of sentience as each person answered those questions. So I don't think that would have affected the results because we were quite clear about that. There was just a question on that sentience theme, and I think you did touch on this, but maybe expand a bit more, just whether attitudes varied by which animals were viewed as sentient. That was, so the second question was actually about sample size. So I think you've already covered that.
So sample size, because I sped through the whole thing, unfortunately. Sample size was 1,000, which is generally, that's a good sample size for a national survey. We wouldn't want to go too much smaller, but a lot of surveys sit around the 500 to 1,000 mark. So that's pretty representative.
Yeah, and make that, so that means when it says nationally representative, that 1,000 is spread according to the population distribution of Australia. Yes.
Correct. Yeah. So people in regional Queensland have answered the survey. People in Melbourne have, and it's the same proportion as would be in the population as much as possible.
Yeah. So just going back to the sentience question, do you think that people's views around animal sentience were affecting the way they answered other questions?
That's a good question. It's not something that we have looked into in terms of like comparing the results to see if somebody answered one question one way and one the other. So I can't say for certain, but I wouldn't say so because they were so small. We see that there's so many people, so much of the population sees these animals as sentient that when we look at the rest of the questions, there's already that sort of influencing the results anyway. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's like it's very unlikely that we got a sample of people that are not representative of the population and they all think that most animals are sentient and then answered all the other questions the same way. But yes, it's not something we've actually teased apart to have a look at in more detail, but we can.
Yeah, and I know that those generally the responses to those questions were the same as in 2023. So it does suggest that this is what Australians think. It's concerning that when we have those high levels of support, that actually we still don't have sentience recognition in many states. And I know Jen will talk more about this. Seems to be quite a high level of resistance to that from some stakeholders, but it's certainly not reflected by the Australian public. Thank you so much, Meg. We will move on and still a chance for people to ask questions at the end. I'd like now to introduce Jed Goodfellow, my colleague at the Australian Alliance for Animals. Jed is co-founder and director of policy and government relations at the Alliance and has an extensive background in animal welfare law, policy and advocacy. The regulation of animal welfare was the subject of his PhD. He's one of those few people that actually gets to work on the subject of his PhD in the rest of his working life. So Jed now leads the Alliance's political engagement strategy, which encompasses federal and state jurisdictions. And I'll hand over to Jed to talk about how Australia is meeting the expectations of the Australian public. Thanks so much, Jed.
Right, thanks very much, Peter, and thanks, Meg, for that fantastic presentation and overview. So yes, we're going to now just very briefly at a very high level look at some of these key elements and assess the extent to which the Australian government, and broadly we're including state and territory and federal governments in this, are meeting the expectations that we've just heard from Meg. And we're using this sort of little symbol here to rate it on a scale of poor to excellent in terms of how many of those elements are being met. And yes, I don't think it'll be too much of a newsflash for many of you here that on most indicators it will be in the sort of orange brackets here of poor to fair. So, and I'll be going through this fairly quickly, but again, yeah, much of this data and the slides will be available after the presentation. So when it comes to recognising animal sentience in law, of course, we heard from Meg that was highly supported. 71% of Australians would like to see this. Now, on this measure, we've given a rating of fair because we have seen a little bit of progress since the last time we conducted this survey. So, of course, the ACT, Animal Welfare Act, recognises animal sentience, but we've now seen the South Australian Animal Welfare Act do the same, although it did not use the S word of sentience, but it still recognised what animal sentience is as a principle of the legislation, which was positive. But even more promising, we've seen in international trade agreements now that Australia is a party to. The UK Free Trade Agreement recognises animal sentience, and indeed the EU Free Trade Agreement, which was just concluded a couple of days ago. In fact, I think it might have been yesterday. We're going to see the text of that agreement next week, but we're very confident that that agreement will also include prominent recognition of animals as sentient beings as well. So good movements in a positive direction there. Victoria's Animal Care and Protection Bill, or at least the draft version of that bill, which has not been introduced to Parliament yet, I must note. It also proposes to recognise animal sentience as well. But so that's positive, moving in the right direction, but all other jurisdictions currently fail to recognise animal sentience in their Animal Welfare Acts expressly. And some also exclude sentient animals such as fish, cephalopods and crustaceans as well. So we've given that a fair rating just because there has been some progress, but there's a lot of work still to be done on that measure. And I just wanted to unpack a little bit of what Meg was talking about here in terms of the cross-sector, the broad support that we see all through different regions of Australia and different political backgrounds as well. And indeed, on all of the measures I'll be talking about, the support from regional Australians is higher than the support from metro Australians. So 72.2% support from regional Australia, 69.9% from those in metro regions. And this really just bucks that narrative around there being some kind of divide between city and country when it comes to animal welfare matters. There really isn't any kind of difference. In fact, as we see in the data, people in regional areas of Australia actually have higher levels of support for many of these reforms. Likewise, with the political party breakdowns, with the exception there of national supporters. However, even with national supporters, as you can see, there's more national supporters who support recognising animal sentience in law, 43.5%, than there are opposing it. So even though it's not a majority per se, it's still there's more Nationals supporters who are supporting that measure, and wide support across the board with other political orientations as well. When it comes to the element of decision makers being required by law to reduce the impacts upon animals, or at least consider those impacts and mitigate them, no jurisdiction currently requires this under their animal welfare legislation. But again, the Victorian Animal Care and Protection Bill is proposing to do a sort of a similar thing in terms of recognising a principle that in the administration of the legislation, regard should be given to the capacity of animals to subjectively perceive and experience positive and negative physical and mental states. Not a binding obligation, but nevertheless a positive principle. And it also includes a power for the minister to create decision-making guidelines that would apply to public authorities making decisions that may affect the welfare of animals. So that's also positive as well. But we haven't got that in practice yet. So we've given that a poor rating currently, but there are glimmers of hope in terms of future legislative models, including that element. And again, we see higher rates of support in regional Australia for this measure compared to Metro Australia, but again, over 70% support across the country. And likewise with the political party breakdown as well. And indeed, even for the Nationals here, 60.9% of those supporting the National Party support this measure as well, and much higher rates of support with some of the other parties there, including, of course, One Nation as well. When this survey was conducted, it was conducted around the same time as this real surge that One Nation is experiencing at the moment. So it captured a lot of those people. And we're seeing reasonably high levels of support from those who support One Nation as well. But of course, yeah, Labor, Liberal, Independents, all very high levels of support as well. And the principle of independent and impartial oversight of animal welfare policy, 78% of Australians supporting this. Of course, many of you will know when it comes to the oversight of animal welfare policy in Australia, it's primarily delegated to Ministers for Agriculture and Departments of Agriculture, which have those competing priorities and cannot be considered to be independent in their approach to animal welfare policy and standards development. So we've given that a poor rating. However, again, there's some glimmers of hope here. The federal government established the Independent Inspector General of Animal Welfare at the federal level to oversee the Department of Agriculture's performance in regulating the live animal export trade. And the New South Wales government has committed to establishing an independent Office of Animal Welfare. So they're currently working on that at the moment, and we expect to see a proposal around that measure in the very foreseeable future. So that will be the first of its kind in the country once that is established, and then based on that, we could potentially be moving this dial in the future if future state governments and indeed at the federal level start adopting a similar structural reform. And again, high levels of support. Regional Australia, again, 78.5% support for this. Also in Metro, 76%. And likewise, breakdown on political party orientation. Sorry if that's quite small font, but even with the Nationals there, 60.9%. One Nation supporters, 75.5%. And then, other high levels of support with the other parties there. The Independents, 86%, I think that says. It might be something in the name that attracts their support there, but highly value independence in animal welfare policy and governance. Moving to the timeliness of standards review and updating standards. So as we heard from Meg, 79% of Australians believe that the standards and regulations should be updated every 1 to 5 years. So quite a high expectation there. And of course, we've given this a poor rating because when you look at the age of Australia's current model codes of practice and standards of guidelines around the country, they're quite dated. Only the poultry standards, which were endorsed back in 2023, would be considered to sort of meet this expectation. But as you can see there, we've got some model codes that are over 3 decades old, developed back in the early 90s. And there's just not a lot of progress on reviewing these standards because state and federal governments currently are not investing significantly in reviewing those standards and bringing them up to date. The national pig standards have been on the Animal Welfare Task Group's agenda for many, many years. No jurisdiction wants to put their hand up to lead the development and review of those standards. So it's really clear that this is one of the major areas where we need to see greater investment and reform on behalf of both state and federal governments collectively. And then, yes, also clear support here. The first bracket there, every year, every 2 to 3 years in the second bracket, every 4 to 5 years in the third bracket, and that's where the majority of the support is, both regional and metro. Likewise, again, with the political party breakdowns as well. And of course, Nationals there, 78% support 1 to 5 years, even from the National Party supporters. So again, we see cross-political and cross-regional support throughout Australia for these reforms. So in conclusion, Australians very much recognise that animals are sentient beings and expect to see that recognised in law. They support accountability in decision-making. They value independence and impartiality in policy development. They expect adequate levels of funding and timely review of standards and regulations. And probably the most pleasing finding to come out of all of this is that those reforms are supported across political and geographical lines. So the idea, again, that we hear from some political parties that their animal welfare is just a focus of sort of inner city voters is just not borne out by the data and evidence here. So we'll be certainly conveying these findings to political parties and our governments across Australia.
Thanks so much, Jed. I have, that was just, really puts it all into context for us. I just want to remind people that you can still ask questions. So we've got a little bit of time to do a Q&A till the end of the webinar. So please pop those back into the Q&A. I've got a question about the current context. So I know people may be aware, and I think you mentioned this at the beginning of your presentation, that the Victorian government's withdrawn its review of the Animal Care and Protection Act. So that review, which was supposed to be completed ahead of the Victorian election, we understand isn't going to happen now. What are your thoughts on this in the context of these findings, where there's such strong support from all types of voters for better animal welfare laws?
Yeah, you may have seen a little bit of media on this issue just today, actually. There was an article in The Guardian about it. So just to clarify, the Victorian government has concluded its review of the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act. It's established or drafted a new Animal Care and Protection Bill, and there's been a lot of consultation on that draft bill. However, the government now has made a decision that it won't be introducing that bill prior to the next election, which, of course, is really disappointing to really everyone who cares about animal welfare in Victoria. So I think, yes, these findings, which, of course, again, we'll be bringing to the attention of Victorian parliamentarians across the board, it could be potentially quite damaging during the election, certainly when we saw those high rates of support for candidates who seem to be strong on animal welfare policy. So a government not only that doesn't prioritise animal welfare, but also fails to meet the commitments and promises that it has conveyed to the community, it can be quite damaging for their brand and profile with people across the state. So yes, our strong advice to the Victorian Labor Party is to prioritise this bill and bring it on before the next election.
Thanks, Jed. And obviously, we're all aware, particularly following the South Australian election, of how volatile the political situation is in Australia, and real change in terms of moving support away from the main political parties to independents, and and there's this surge in support for One Nation. Could you maybe just touch on how you think that might affect the sort of change in support for animal welfare policy in the context of the findings of the survey?
Yeah, well, look, it was really pleasing to see that with those people who were supporting One Nation, there was still high levels of support for these animal welfare reforms as well. One Nation, of course, the supporter base for One Nation is quite diverse. So we have no reason to think that we're not also going to find avenues for getting reforms through with parliaments that may have more One Nation representation in the future, because again, the data is showing that though their base, those people who support One Nation also support animal welfare measures. So that's the message we want to get out to political parties across the spectrum, is that there is cross-political support for these reforms. So it is they're very much popular reforms that should be appealing to political parties across the spectrum.
Thanks, Jed. Yeah, it's just really good to see that breadth and strength of support for so many of these things. Couple of questions that have just come through. I think I'll just ask this one. We're just asking about the attention being given to influencing the school education system about animal welfare policy. Have any measures been taken to have school curriculums include subjects on animal welfare? Not entirely within the remit of what we do at the Alliance for Animals, but certainly something that some of our core member organisations have contributed to in the past. And I think Voiceless, in particular, one of our members have developed resources for schools around animal welfare policy. It's something to look up. There's another question just about, I guess this is generally speaking about the welfarist approach, which to the reform of animal welfare policy, and just noting that people want to treat animals with care and respect, but we still have a society where the majority of people continue to support farming animals. I think I'll just comment on that you know the survey results indicate that regardless of people's dietary choices or ideology, the level of support for animal welfare reform is strong across all kinds of voters and all kinds of Australians. And we do actually ask demographic information around those sorts of things that you'll be able to interrogate in the full report when that's published. But what we're looking at the moment are the sorts of reforms that we know that the vast majority of Australians support. You know, we continue to be frustrated that governments don't pick up on these very strongly supported reforms in terms of some of the policies that they could be implementing now. Did you want to expand on that at all, Jed?
Just to say that, yeah, that's that gap between where community expectations are, as we've just seen here, and where our current standards lie, and our current governance arrangements for animal welfare policy is precisely the gap that the Alliance is seeking to close, because that's the area where I guess is most feasible for reform. We live in a democracy, and for all its faults, it's a pretty decent system, and we can work within that system. But we've got to convey the community's expectations directly to those political leaders at times when politicians are actually listening, and that's ultimately during and leading up to elections. And that's why the Alliance focuses so much on those election campaigns and being, I guess, a bit of a conduit between the millions of Australians who care about animals and want to see more reform and our political leaders at the end of the day. So,
yeah. Thanks, Jed. Just one last question, just asking whether the Alliance is involved with the new Australian animal welfare strategy. So, yeah, the answer is yes. We are, and we work with our members to help coordinate animal welfare organisations providing input into the development of that strategy. It's going very slowly at the moment, I would say, and but we are continuing to engage in stakeholder groups that the federal government is organising to try and progress that strategy. It is an election commitment for that strategy to be developed in this term of government, and obviously we will be pushing for implementation and further funding for that strategy coming up to the next federal election. We are very nearly out of time, so I would like to wrap up by thanking our speakers. Thank you, Meg. Thank you, Jed. Really fascinating results here. And also to everyone who's joined us for your time and for your great questions. If you'd like to get involved with our work, The QR codes on the screen at the moment will take you to a couple of places, whether you're an individual or representing an organisation. There are things that you can do to support our work, to follow our work, and see what we are up to. This session has been recorded, so we'll send you details of how to access the recording and the survey results over the next few days. And that is a wrap, I think. Thank you, everybody, and have a great rest of your week.